Okay, from CJ, says, Rabbi, Proverbs 3:1. Is there a teaching available? What's dealing with Torah observance and what Paul writes in Galatians 3:1 through 18? It's the Christian mindset, but I'm struggling with that part.
All right, so let me get to from Galatians. Okay, I know what you're talking about. Okay. All right, first of all, how do I want to say this? I don't have time to unravel Galatians 3 for you. I think we've done that on some teachings where we've gone into it to some degree. This is the important thing for those of you that are coming from a struggling Christian Pauline mindset. By Pauline, meaning the way Christianity has taught you, Paul. Okay? If anything that Paul taught is causing you a problem, put it down. I didn't say Paul's wrong. I didn't say get rid of him. I just said put it down. But Rabbi, what do you mean by Rabbi? If anything Peter wrote or John wrote or James wrote is bothering you, put it down. You don't need any of these things. Read Revelation. Read all the things that the apostles did in the books of Acts. All they did was use the Old Testament and their experiences with Yeshua to bring thousands and thousands and thousands of people into the covenant. So if they were able to do it without Paul or James or John or anything but the Gospels, so what do you need? You know, what does he say to Timothy? He says, don't forget the scriptures that you had since you were a kid. Well, it wasn't any of the New Testament. Plus, what else did he have? The testimony about Yeshua. That's the Gospels. All right? So what do you need? You need the Gospels and you need the Torah. Is the writings of Peter and John and James and all that stuff useful? Oh, yeah, I think they're very useful. But they're not useful if you're totally been indoctrinated through one way of seeing them. Okay? And so if that at this time is a stumbling block, is a tripping block, and there's not time necessarily to have it unraveled, just put it up on, I have a shelf. It's not a real shelf, but a shelf that I put stuff up on. If I don't know what to do with it scripturally, stick it up on the shelf. It may stay there a long time. It may come down after a short while. It doesn't matter. But it doesn't cause me any more problems. Okay? And so you can put things on the shelf. Now, generally, you should ask me or ask another teacher if you have a question about something before you stick it on the shelf. And in this case, I am telling you that until this thing can get unraveled for you, hindering, put it on the shelf. Now, second point, key point with this. Yeah, your mic's still on, Rob. Okay, second key point with this. It's very important for you dealing with Paul's writings that more than knowing what he's saying, you have to know what he can't be saying. Do you understand what I just said? More than knowing what he is saying, you have to know what he can't be saying. What do you mean by that, Rabbi? Well, I mean this. If Paul, and I've said this to many Christians who want to argue with me, I said, I don't argue. I just say, okay, if Paul is saying what you're saying he's saying, in other words, using it to do away with the law and saying it's bad and all this other stuff, well then, he's a heretic and he needs to be thrown out of the book. So you have two choices. Either he's saying exactly what you think he's saying, well then he needs to be thrown out, or just maybe you're not understanding him correctly and what he's saying is totally fine, you just don't understand it. I choose B. Okay? But he cannot be fine and saying what you think he's saying. Otherwise, he would be heretical. Okay? And so understand that first. That doesn't fix your problem in understanding what he is saying, but at least you can understand what he can't be saying. Because if he was, he would be what's called a Deuteronomy 13 false teacher, leading people away from the Torah, which he is the excuse for almost all of Christianity's doing away with the Torah. Not because I think Paul actually did that, just because of the way they've chosen to interpret the things he said, because they had no idea what he was talking about. Just like the whole thing in Romans about, the idea of the law of sin and death. And that one I explained quite extensively in a few teachings. Okay, so I don't know where, I can't remember which teachings they're in at the moment. If anybody knows, you can raise your hand. But that was covered quite a bit. And you'll have to, go back and look at that. But, at some point, maybe I'll go through the book of Galatians just separately and try to line that all up. But until then, why let something cause you to stumble just because you don't understand? Because it seems to be, the reason you're struggling is because it seems to be flying completely at odds with the rest of the scripture. Okay, well, I'll give you another tool that you've heard me say not if you're new probably, then you haven't, but the rest of you have heard me say lots of times. If I've got 99 verses that say A and 1 or 2 verses that seem to say B, the problem's not with the 99 verses. Okay? The problem's with the 2. Just like when I took you today and showed you verses that talk about the exact same thing, where we was talking about the idea we were in Colossians, and I connected that to the idea of being when you were in your former walk of life and you were separated from things. Remember, he's saying that to the Colossians. So, wow, look, he's saying the exact same thing to the Ephesians. And let me give you even more clarity. You were then without Elohim, without covenant, without anything, without any expectation or hope. And so you can start to connect things together. Or like when you read Proverbs and then you go, well, wait a minute, what about this teacher thing? Well, he says when you need to find the wisdom from above, etc. Well, let's go to Jeremiah. Actually, we got a whole teaching called Learn and Teach the Torah, which is all about making a case for Torah teachers from Scripture. Okay, so hopefully it's a great question. What do you do with the mainstream Christianity's use of Paul to undermine everything else that I'm teaching or that any Torah teacher is teaching? Well, the answer is you have to first understand the foundation. The old doesn't fit into the new fits into the old. Paul teaches us about the root and the foundation in Romans 11. The tree is built on the root, not the other way around. The branches don't bear the tree, the root bears the branches. Okay? Okay, so this is really important as we go through. And you guys are forcing me to end up in Revelation. Revelation 12 and verse 17. And the dragon was enraged with the woman and went out to fight with the remnant of her seed, those guarding the writings of Paul and the... No? Those guarding the commands of Elohim and possessing the Gospels or the witnesses of Yeshua Messiah. And by the way, I'm not picking on Paul. You don't need James or John or Peter either. I'm not saying John as in the Gospel with the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John or 1st and 2nd Peter. I find them powerfully helpful and useful, but you could get where you need to get with just the 4 Gospels in the Old Testament. If you don't believe that, then how in the world did thousands come in Acts chapter 2 and 3 and 4 and 5? Thousands of them. And all they had was witnesses to Yeshua's life in the Old Testament. They didn't have any of Paul's writing. Paul was attacking them at this time still. This is before he had his little moment on the road. How did all those thousands come in? See, that's the point. If it was doable, then it's doable. If they did it, then it has to be doable. They did it because I had a guy leave our congregation because he asked me one day, and he did it very respectfully. He asked me off on the side privately, do I think that we need Paul? I said, no. I said, you said need, right? He said, yes. I said, no, you do not need Paul, but you also don't need James, John, or Peter. At least Scripture tells me I don't. It says I need the commandments, which is the Tanakh, the Old Testament. I need that, and I need the testimony, which is the Gospels, to tell me what Yeshua did. I need that. Think of the other writings as, I don't want to elevate me or diminish them, but people like me at the time who had a greater understanding trying to teach people how to apply the Tanakh and the knowledge of Yeshua. These were the anointed teachers giving their congregations and people that they were writing to their understanding of how you take the two and explain what the benefit you get from having both of these things. This is now, of course, James and Peter are writing to the dispersion. Paul's writing to congregations. Okay, John's also writing to the dispersion. But they have an audience that's trying to say, look, you guys need to understand how these two things are necessary together to get you where you're trying to get to. And they're speaking to an audience that should have understood what they were saying the way they said it. You guys are 2,000 years away from when Paul wrote what he wrote. I can go get you some things written in English from like 700 years ago, you won't understand a word. And you're trying to understand through translations and through filters what someone said 2,000 years ago. That's why it's so hard for us to do things today with our books and our translations. And so let's be careful with that. So good question. I appreciate the question. And hopefully there was a lot of new people that got to hear that. I'll say it again just so it's clear. You have to know what he can't be saying more than knowing what he is saying. And that's something you can figure out much more easily. You should know that if he's saying A, B, C, or D, that's a big problem, and he's a problem if that's true. And by the way, there's a lot of people out there really think he's a problem because they don't know what to do with what he's written. I don't agree with them necessarily. I'm just saying, but there are people out there because they don't know how to deal with what he said or what people think he said.